Hey gardeners, Enoch here from the Urban Gardener with another Johnny Appleseed Organics Gardening Invitational category video. And today we're talking about the category heaviest squash. Now last year I grew a 137-pound pumpkin right here in our alleyway garden spaces. Now this pumpkin, it was big and awkward, and it took two of us to move it. That was only 137 pounds. Now this year, I want to grow even bigger, and that's going to take some work. Now, all of those big competition pumpkins you see at state fairs and all of that, those gardeners are putting in a lot of work in order to grow those big, large squash. So I asked one of my friends, Cindy Tobeck from up in Washington State, who won last year's Great Pumpkin Commonwealth Master Gardeners Competition hands down. And I asked her to join us to give us a little bit of advice about growing the heaviest squash and tell us a little bit about that competition. So all right, everyone, we've got a grade school teacher, and she also shows show horses. Plus, in her spare time, she's growing out giant vegetables in her patch at home and winning world records while she's doing that. We've got from Washington State, Cindy Tobeck. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Urban Gardener, Cindy.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Excellent, excellent. So, last year in 2021, you set a world record and won the, what is it, the Great Commonwealth, Great Commonwealth, Great
Pumpkin
Pumpkin
Commonwealth.
Commonwealth Master Gardeners Competition. Could you tell us a little bit about that competition?
Yeah, so the Great Pumpkin Commonwealth, or the GPC, is the governing body for giant vegetable fruit competition. And they're kind of like the NFL. They have the rules, establish rules, and enforce the rules to ensure fair play worldwide at all these different sanctioned competitions. And the Master Gardener competition is one of the competitions that they sanctioned, and a lot of people consider it to be the most difficult of their contests because of the amount of work involved. The GPC recognizes 8 classes of giant fruits, and to be the Master Gardener, you have to get 5 of them to the scale.
5 of those. Okay. And so, which 5 did you bring to scale this last year to win this competition?
So in 2021, I set my sights early on being the GPC Master Gardener, but I didn't want to just be, the winner. I wanted to be the greatest winner of all time and post
Yes.
biggest score ever.
Excellent.
And I achieved that, and also got a world record with my 5 things, which were the giant squash, and that weighed 2,030 pounds, and it was a new Washington State record, number 2 in the world. I really thought I was going to
Wow.
be number 1 in the world, but someone
Oh,
right at the 11th hour snuck in a bigger one.
oh.
um, 1,737, or was it 38? I don't know. It was right up there. Pound pumpkin,
At
and I
that
took
point, it's
that
1 pound,
to
right?
yeah, I took that to Half Moon Bay and got 4th with that at the World Pumpkin Championship. A 7.19 pound tomato, which was a personal
Wow.
best for me, and number 8 in the world. 129 and 3/4 inch long gourd, which was the second biggest one I've ever
That's
grown.
big. Yeah.
And my 152.5 pound giant marrow, which is kind of like a big giant zucchini.
Wow. Those are some really big, big vegetables there. And like you said, you set a major record for this competition. And really quickly, how many people would you say are in this competition worldwide?
It's hard to say exactly how many people attempt it because it's very difficult to
Yeah.
get all five, let alone one giant variety to the scale. I mean, there are just so many things that can go wrong, but I want to say that there are probably around, give or take, 200 people that qualify with, the top, um, getting five to the scale.
Yeah.
And yeah, and
That's
it's
quite a bit of
considered to
people.
be very difficult, just because, like I said, just getting a giant pumpkin to the scale
Yeah.
alone is hard. But when you add all those other categories and have to time everything, everything's on its own timeline, and so
Hmm.
that's a lot of coordination. But I think it's fair to say upwards of 200 people.
Wow, that's great. Worldwide competition, 200 people, and you really, really, I mean, there was a big gap. I remember seeing, I can't remember what the exact score was, but I know there was a big gap between first and second place, and you really did make your goal, like you said. So you've set a goal, you've accomplished it, you've become a world record giant grower. When did you set your mind to growing out giant vegetables like this?
Yeah, when I was very young, I want to say kindergarten, my family bought some land and it used to be an old dairy farm. And my dad built the house there. And then once that was completed, both my parents put in that first garden. And I'd never had a garden before. And I was just absolutely enamored with the big pumpkins that my dad planted. And
Yeah.
so I was constantly out in the garden watching those things because they grew unbelievably fast, the plants. And
Yeah.
then once the pumpkins got on and established, I mean, I was just hooked. Um, and I thought they were the biggest pumpkins in the world, because I was in kindergarten and they probably were pushing 200 pounds.
Yeah.
And so this was in 1980, and my dad told me, well, if you think these are big, I'm going to take you to the state fair and show you some really big pumpkins. And so I still remember that, going to the Puyallup Fair and seeing the really big pumpkins. And I knew, boy, that is what I'm going to do someday. That is my calling. And so I always remembered, how much I loved that. And it was in college that I finally got around to growing another, or other than when I was in kindergarten, a
Yeah.
giant pumpkin of some size. And I was doing my student teaching, and this was in 1997.
Yeah.
And part of my student teaching was I helped to build a big, really nice school garden.
Oh,
And so we
goodness.
we grew some
Yeah.
giant pumpkins in that garden. I think the kids and I grew a 479 pounder,
Wow.
which in 1997 was a pretty big pumpkin.
Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. That's really awesome. So you competed, I guess you say, around with 200, maybe more people from around the world. You've set world records. I'm in a competition, luckily with only six other competitors, but I've got wanted to ask you about some tips for growing some of these, or growing the squash that we have, seeds that you were kind enough to send to us here a couple of months back, and I've got those growing out now. But do you have any tips for growing those out and getting the biggest squash that we've grown?
Yeah, so growing giant pumpkins and giant squash is they're pretty much the same techniques because
Hmm.
they're the same species. The squash just has a extra green gene to give it its beautiful color. Seed selection is a big deal. When you're growing out giant squash, you
Yes.
really want to pay attention to the parentage and make sure that maybe it's a proven seed and you've seen its progeny before and you know it's going to be green. If it's a new squash like mine, it hasn't been proven out yet, and you just cross your fingers and hope it's going to be green. That's the tricky thing about squash is that sometimes because they're so closely related to the giant pumpkins, you may have some genetics coming out that you don't necessarily want, like hints of orange or yellow, or they start out green but they get more white. So
Wow.
seed selection's big. I think another thing that's very important is to um, have really good, healthy soil. I test my soil in the early spring, and then I amend it so that I know, what's in it as far as organic matter and what my major and minor nutrient levels are, and then I can add things to it before planting time. And also, very importantly, is adjusting the pH. I like to have my pH right around 7.0, and
Okay.
maybe 6.8 at the low end and 7.2 at the high end, but 7 seems to be a pretty sweet spot so that the plant can access all those major and minor nutrients that it's going to need throughout the season. Um, Watering is a very big consideration once you've got the soil how you want it. I do not water my young plants very often at all, maybe once every 5 or 6 days, because I really want them to get tough, and I want them to send out a lot of roots in order to have a really big fruit in the summer, and then later into the fall that plant needs to have a massive root system. And so, kind of training it with some tough love at the beginning is important. And then I also use, and the jury's still out, whether this is effective or not, but it seems like the most successful growers use it, and that's um, using mycorrhizal fungi when
Okay.
you're planting the seed and the plant, when you're burying the vines. That fungi just creates a symbiosis with the root structure,
Okay.
and more roots, more water and nutrient
Yep.
uptake. The
Yeah.
theory is bigger fruit.
Yeah.
Um, and then pruning is a very big deal too. If you've never grown a pumpkin before and you try, it will very quickly turn into a jungle, and you don't want
Yeah.
to necessarily grow a bunch of leaves and vines. You want the plant to focus on the fruit. And so, probably the most important thing maintenance wise is pruning, and probably the most popular pattern for pruning is what we call the Christmas tree pattern. And it's whereby the main vine goes out, sending side vines alternating off the main, and you set your pumpkin, you pollinate the fruit on the main at least 10 feet out is kind of a good rule of thumb. And then those side vines that come out, you do not want to have um, any growth coming off that. No tertiary growth for the most part. You just want to have main vine and side vines. Any other vines that come off those side vines, we call that third stage growth or tertiary growth. And you literally nip it in the bud. You don't even want it to start. Um, and so that pruning is probably for a new pumpkin grower one of the most important things that you can do to uh, maximize the growth of your fruit and not the plant.
Excellent. Excellent. Those are some really great tips, some really great advice on growing this big squash. I last year or over the last couple of years have grown pumpkins out in my space that I have, and last year off of it was actually the second fruit that I got. The first one didn't make it, but I got 137 pounds, and it took two people to move it. I couldn't move it myself, so that was a huge pumpkin. That's 137 pounds. I can't imagine what it's like to grow
That's
one
bigger
that's
than
about
me.
two. Yeah, it's really, close to my size as well, too. And I just, I can't imagine growing something around 2,000 pounds. And again, when this competition got started, I knew I had to reach out to you. I've been following along with you in the competition over the last couple of years, and I knew I had to reach out to you to see about getting seeds. And you were kind enough to send out seeds to us, and I've got those all started, and I'm really excited about growing them. I don't know if I'm going to get quite up to about the size that you grow, but I'm going to try my best to get the biggest that I can. Now, one last question for you, real quick, because I just at the beginning mentioned that you're also a grade school teacher. What do all of your
Hmm.
kids, what do all of your kids think about all of your large vegetables that you grow?
Oh, they're like some of my biggest fans. And when we were in COVID lockdown and I was teaching remotely from home, um,
Yes.
that was a lot of fun actually to take them with me out to the pumpkin patch. And we would do all the time. We would measure the pumpkins. We would learn about perimeter, circumference, area out in the pumpkin patch. We would measure the long gourds for length. It was just a lot of fun,
Yeah.
making the best of that situation, a very difficult situation. Um, by sharing myself and my hobbies with them. When it was way off time, we still weren't back to school yet, so they came with me to California, down to Oregon, and they really enjoyed it. They love to Google me because they think I'm so famous because I pop up with all these horse show and pumpkin show pictures, and they really enjoy it. It's a lot of fun.
Well, you are a world record holder, so in all of our mind, I guess you would be world famous. So, congratulations on the competition, Cindy, and thanks again for joining with us here and giving us some great advice on growing the biggest squash that we can for our competition. Thank you.
You're welcome. Growing big this year. We're going to have a really good summer in the Northwest, and so seize that opportunity.
Excellent. Thanks again, Cindy. 3 days ago, I started our squash seeds by sanding the tip of the seed down with sandpaper and placing it into a paper towel, wetting it down inside of a plastic bag. I placed that into a warm, dark location of the house. 2 days later, we had one of our seeds sprout, and then I buried that into some soil, leaving just the very tip at the very top. And then those other two weren't quite sprouted yet, but here it is, just 1 day later. I'm going to check them out here and see these things are really set to grow here. They're set to go off. They've already got a nice root starting to sprout out. So we're gonna have to bury these here into our pots. Kind of make that a little deep there for those because they already got a nice root there. Put that down there. Gently too. We don't want to snap or break that root at all. It's really important that we're really careful there. And all right, and what I want to do is just bury that over nice and gently again, not packing that in too tight. Just burying it just so we're barely covering over those tops. And then, like I said, it was just a day before that we buried that one into its pot. It's already sprouting up and popping up, which means that that root system's already starting to grow inside of the soil. So here, just another day later, it'll probably be the same for these, as they're really taking off really fast. So there are a lot of things to be thinking about when it comes to growing our biggest squash that we've ever grown before. But first and foremost, again, we were really lucky to be able to get some really good genetics and get some really good seeds from Cindy up there in Washington to be able to grow the biggest one we can get. We are limited by some other factors, but with the good genetics and maybe a little bit of care, we can get a really good sized fruit off of these plants. And now our seedlings have pretty much emerged from their seeds, as they're about ready to shed off the seed coat, and the first true leaves are about to emerge as well. And at this point, I want to get these out of these smaller containers and also get them outdoors as well too. It's starting to warm up around here, so we should be doing pretty good in keeping them out here so they can get good natural sunlight to continue their growth and development. So I've got a really good sized pots here to transplant them into so that the roots can really get out and spread around, and I'm not really bunching them up or allowing them to bunch up too much over the next couple of weeks, because we're gonna have to wait just a little bit longer to get them into our growing space. So we'll go ahead and just create a nice little hole here for our seedling. Make sure it's nice and deep enough for the hole. And we'll make sure I get that nice and loose so we can try to get this whole thing out all at once. Yep, just a little bit of roots there, all ready to spread out without disturbing them much at all. Put that seedling right into that larger pot. There we go. Now we've got all three of our potential contender giant squashes in their larger containers. And again, we're going to be letting these grow in there and let those roots kind of expand out in these larger containers, and hopefully try to be just as gentle in transplanting these out into their grow spaces that they'll be growing out in throughout the season. I'm really excited about seeing how well and how big of a squash that we can get. Now again, I'm not too sure we're going to be able to compete with the squashes that Cindy Tobeck has grown up there in Washington to be able to break those world records, but we'll get something pretty big. I'm pretty sure of that for sure. So again, thank you to Cindy for joining with us and giving us some really great tips on growing a really giant squash. I mean, who better to ask questions and get some advice from than a world champion grower and a world record holder? So thanks again, Cindy, to giving us that advice and giving us these really awesome seeds. Not only our squash seeds too, but some of those tomato contenders that we've got as well. And thank all of you for following along with me here on the Urban Gardener as we continue growing here for all of our different categories here on the Johnny Appleseed Organics Gardening Invitational. And hopefully we're gonna have the biggest squash for this category. We'll see all of you on our next video. Thank you everyone for watching this video on our Johnny Appleseed Organics Invitational. And remember, these videos run every other week. And on next week, be sure to tune in and check out another one of our micro pepper farm vlogs. So, we'll see all of you next week.